Good morning, everyone. My name is Pam Valentine, and I am the interim CEO for Alberta Innovates. I'd like to welcome you to this Health Policy Speaker Series that we're presenting in partnership with the Institute of Health Economics. And represented here today, we have Dr. Lauren Terrell, the chair of IHE, and Doug Gilpin, who is on both the board of IHE and now Alberta Innovates. So very pleased to have you both here. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Abby Angel, president of the Friends of the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the organization that created the Henry Friesen International Prize, which of course was awarded last year to our guest speaker. I'd also like to welcome Lauren Dack, MLA from Edmonton-McClung, Drew Barnes, MLA from Cypress Medicine Hat, and David Swan, member of the Legislative Assembly. One of the many challenges in health research today is how to go about attracting investment and the role that research can play in strengthening an economy. These are very salient considerations in Alberta today. Discussions are happening not only in Alberta, but across Canada and North America about the role that research can play as an economic driver. This is why it's so important to learn from other jurisdictions, and tap into the expertise of leaders in this area, such as Sir Paul Nurse, our guest speaker today. It is an honor and a delight for me to introduce Sir Paul Nurse. From 2003 to 2011, Sir Paul was the chief executive of the cancer research in the UK and president of Rockefeller University in New York City. He is a seasoned public advocate and has had frequent appearances on TV, including BBC, PBS, print media, and I think maybe he's talking to CBC later today. The pinnacle of Sir Paul's most prestigious awards, we all know, was the 2001 Nobel Prize in Physiology. Sir Paul is the head of the Francis Crick Institute, a unique partnership between 6 of the UK's most successful scientific institutions. The Crick is a new type of biomedical research institute that emphasizes groundbreaking research across a range of scientific disciplines and helps to ensure that laboratory discoveries are turned into treatments as quickly as possible. Please join me in giving a very warm Alberta welcome to Sir Paul Nurse.
Thank you very much for a nice introduction, and thank you all for coming so early in the morning. It's a pleasure to see you. It's not my first time to Alberta. I've been here a number of times, including walking in the mountains, but it is my first time to Edmonton. And I'm very sorry about this terrible fire just north of the city here. I'm going to talk about the Francis Crick Institute, which is this new institute, as you've just heard, that we're setting up in London. And we're trying to do things a little differently, and that includes the logo, okay? So this is possibly the first dynamic logo you have ever seen. Look at it. Bang, okay? 21st century logo. That is actually the most exciting slide in my talk. So this institute is somewhat unusual, and I want to explain how it will work. It's putting together practices that occur throughout the world in different places, but I'm not aware of anywhere that has put everything together like this in one place. It's to some extent experimental, and therefore partly it will fail, and we will learn from that failure as we will go on. I'm going to start just by telling you the thoughts behind it that drove its establishment. It was my concept. I'd had this idea for some years, and what I was thinking about were a number of things that I've tried to incorporate into how it's been set up and even how the building itself was designed. What I felt were important factors in driving the highest quality research that can lead to public benefit through translation and innovation were the following sorts of issues. It was crucial to provide excellent opportunities for younger researchers to achieve independence early in their careers. I'm sure you're all aware of the statistics that show, for example, in North America, in the United States, that now independent grants, the first independent grants in biomedicine, are delayed till individuals are age 41, 42, by which time it must be said my own career was on its decline. And so I think that that's a really important issue. We have to give them good support so that they can at least establish a small group. And it's important that the leadership is close to the coal face. That is, that they understand what is going on. When you have a grant-giving circumstances, which of course we mostly have to have, it can lead to a divorce from the decision-making from actually those on the ground doing the work. So a leadership close to what they are doing, a focus on training, encouragement of a longer-term view, a longer perspective, rather than short-term pressure for grants after 1, 2, or 3 years. To try and establish and encourage multidisciplinary approaches. Often said, trips off the tongue, really difficult to do well. I've had a lot of experience of the difficulties there, particularly for a biomedical institute. How do we interact well with the physical sciences? How do we interact well with the clinical sciences and clinical care? So those multidisciplinary approaches. To generate an intense culture and atmosphere, but one that is supportive of the people working there. In other words, you need to have high standards, intensity, but also good advice, good mentoring, good support for those that work there. A combination of high aspiration, but support to try and deliver that high aspiration. Also, an operation that can rapidly respond to new developments. So these are the thoughts that have underpinned the institute that I'm going to talk about and that underpin the Francis Crick Institute. So what is it? Well, it's interdisciplinary, as I've said. It's located in central London. That was a struggle to persuade my masters, the political forces, that we should put it in central London. I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. It's a partnership, as you've already heard in my introduction, that of the three major funders of biomedical research in the UK, the MRC, Cancer Research UK, which I used to head up some years ago, and the Wellcome Trust. So they are responsible for 90% of biomedical research funding. And 3 of the great universities in London, University College, Imperial College, and King's College. All 3 of these are in the top 25. I know these league tables don't mean very much, but anyway, at the moment they're in the top 25 places within the world. It is an institute, you see it being built here, large, probably 1,400 scientists, 1,300 is where we start, 120 research groups, and I should get the keys next month. My office moves in July, my lab in August, and everybody else follows up until Christmas. It's a major logistical issue of approximately moving 1,000 scientists from where they're working now till now. Come and fiddle, it's all right. I'll move on this side. I'll just talk so you can play around with the cables. So, how will we achieve this? Well, the first thing is that it's a merger. So not only is it a startup, it's a major merger. Is it solved? No. Right. It's still flashing up here. It's a merger of 2 institutes and 3 university research activities. The MRC, National Institute for Medical Research, that's based in Mill Hill in London. Cancer Research UK's London Research Institute in 2 places, and the 3 universities that I've already mentioned. It also has a strategic partnership with the Wellcome Trust's Sanger Institute. So it's a complex merger. I have so many bosses, I have no bosses at all as a consequence, as you know. The funding is intramural in part, not completely, because I inherit the core funding of those institutes from the MRC and CRUK, and I have a new core-funded strategic grant from the Wellcome Trust. So it will be about, for direct support into the labs, I think the colour is changed up here, so we may be making progress. Okay. It will be funded by core funding.
Looks like.
Good, thank you. Thank you for your help. By core funding, so into the individual labs, forget about overhead and so on, will be between 50% and 65% core funding, and then the rest will be response mode funding through grants. So this is quite a privileged position. It's unusual to have such a heavy core funding, which is controlled by the leadership, but we have to reapply for that core funding every 5 years. As well as being a discovery research institute, I will emphasize this a little later, we will have strong clinical and translational links. And the way I sum all of this up is we are a discovery research institute that is very open to translation. So we give creative control to our scientists, but we have very effective mechanisms at capturing potential work that is of translational interest. I emphasize this because it is a somewhat different way of looking at it than the more top-down translational objectives where you decide you want to do something and then you try and promote translational research in that area. I'm wanting to have a system which liberates the creativity of the individual and then captures what is important, because I think that's a much more effective way of doing it. We may talk a little bit more about it. It's a national institute. I mean, it's the biggest institute in the UK, actually in Europe, apart from the Pasteur Institute. And I do not know a building as big as this, actually, under a single roof. It's approaching 100,000 square meters under one move. Now, the national role. It catalyzes interactions between different institutions. Already, even if we were to fail tomorrow, we have got those 3 London universities talking properly to each other. You know what universities are like. They fight like cat and dogs for resource and reputation. And getting the 3 universities to talk about biomedicine together round the table was a real achievement. We even managed to get them to combine in a single PhD program. All those ridiculously slightly different rules that they hang on to, they've actually managed to work together. Now they try and gang up on me, so it's even better because they have a common enemy. Secondly, it's a place which won't develop technologies perhaps in the same way as Genelia Farm, for those who are familiar with that, but we will be a clear beta site testing for new equipment, new facilities. Have a great emphasis on training of scientists, clinicians, technical staff, and of course, central is ultimately health and wealth creation throughout the whole mission. Just to say something about the training, we will have around 120 research groups. 2/3 of those, when we reach longer-term steady state, will actually be junior appointments, primarily in the range of 30 to 40. They will come for a career stage of 12 years, and then they have to leave. During that time, we provide support, and the more senior investigators have a role in advice, mentoring, and helping them develop. And our notion is this, that we will attract from around the world. We will make decisions at an earlier stage than is usual, around the age of 30. I know I'm not meant to mention ages anymore, but I'm hoping there's not too many lawyers in the room. So around the age of 30. And that in their, towards the end of their contract, we will work with them to place them elsewhere. We will obviously have a preference for somewhere in the UK. If they go to somewhere in the UK, the Institute will give them a startup package to leave. You hear what I'm saying? A startup package to leave to go to a university, Oxford, Birmingham, Edinburgh, or wherever. So instead of hanging on to your best people, we see our role as attracting around the world, training them, and just as they become really, really attractive to a university, they earn grants and so on, we export them elsewhere. Somewhat different model. What are our strategic priorities. Our top line here is discovery without boundaries. What do I mean by that? I mean that we want to do discovery research that lacks boundaries in all respects. No boundaries between research discipline, between organizations. We have universities, funders, healthcare deliveries. No boundaries between basic research and research for translation and application. We undergo collaboration and training, collaboration across the board, including with industry. No boundaries between discovery and translation, no boundaries between the science and public engagement. So our whole operation is driven by discovery without boundaries. Our priorities, and you'll see that there's 4 further there: training, developing future science leaders at all levels, from technical staff running the Animal House up to full professors; collaboration, which are creative, to advance UK science; accelerating translation; and the 5th one you'll see there, a clear, explicit role in engagement and inspiring the public. And the whole front part of the building is in fact open to the public all the time. And we'll have public lectures there, exhibitions, and a coffee place. And we're right next to the Eurostar terminal, and it will be open all the time. So what characterizes this institute? The usual things: world-class research facilities, but we mean world-class. A building, which you'll see a little more of in a moment, designed to be open and encourage interactions. Long-term support through core funding, close to the leadership so they make sensible decisions. Not just counting papers. Papers are important, but sometimes an investigator will take on an important project. It doesn't lead to papers. We can make that judgment, which grant-giving organizations simply cannot do by their distant committees sitting in Ottawa, 2,000 miles away or more from here. You just cannot do it in that sort of way. A size which, although large, is still small on the UK scene. It's only perhaps 2% of the total science budget, so it's public science budget, so it's not that large, but large within a single organization, which allows a critical mass to span a wide variety of disciplines. A career structure, which I've briefly described to you, which allows constant renewal. If we have a career stage at 10 to 12 years, what it will mean is that of the 120 researchers, we will be recruiting 6 to 8 new groups each year. We'll be exporting 6 to 8 groups each year. That means we will renew our program on a regular basis. Over a 10-year period, almost the whole thing will be turned over, certainly of junior recruitments, which allows you to track where science is going. Why is that important? Well, what happens in usual institutions is this. You'll put a committee together, you'll decide stem cell research is important, which is clearly at this moment, or CRISPR-Cas, okay? In 10 years' time, it will be something different. But those institutes set up that way can't move so easily with how things change. If you have a size and turnover, you can track where science goes. It's not that this is the only way to do it. It is a somewhat different way to do it, which allows that particular advantage. The academic partners and hospitals linkages and permeability there, and those links allow us to do multidisciplinary research. There is a scientific program, but it is rather broadly stated. The reason being that the strategy will be to recruit the best athlete that you can find, the best researcher that you can find at any one time, rather than saying we have a complete focus on a particular area. In my experience in recruitment, if you have as a usual targeted recruitment, you will identify an area, let's call it, say you have a weakness in immunology, and you'll put a committee together. You will find the best immunologists that you're able to recruit that year, and it will be okay. And then what will happen is next year, an even better immunologist pops up, but now you're searching in some other area. If you have a broad open search, you will get the best person that you can find across a wide range of disciplines, and over time, it averages out. It's rather like fishing. If you want a big fish, you don't go and fish in the pond in your back garden. you go to a lake. If you are recruiting, you recruit across the board, not in a small pond, and your standards will automatically go up. But our programs are seen here. 3 of them are very general. How do living organisms work and maintain themselves, and how can we use that knowledge for better understanding, particularly with respect to human disease. 4, from 4, 5, 6, 7, are more specific, but still widely stated, to deal with cancer, the immune system, infection, and neuroscience and nervous systems. So these are our broad questions, and it covers much of biomedicine and also catch-alls, which are in the first 3 questions. So a broadly based science program, combined with open recruitment, as I've said. No traditional boundaries. I've already indicated a very broad research areas. We go for quality individuals. It's quality that moves the needle. It's as simple as that. You need the highest quality, and people say it, but they don't deliver the highest quality. You have to have very high standards. Every morning I get up and I drink a glass of vinegar so that I'll be really nasty in the rest of the day. And you need to have high standards. Appoint only the very best, have a long view. Let them establish the agenda. That's what let those who are still have the energy, the creativity, the forward-looking, establish the agenda rather than the white-haired committees who tend to come up with the obvious. It just is, I'm afraid, the case. Of course, I'm practical. If there are imbalances in the portfolio, they can be corrected by conventional approaches. You know, this isn't religion that I'm talking about. We can change the way that we approach to fill in gaps. I prefer small research groups. Initially, for the first number of years, a group of around 4 or 5. I won't let even the best researchers go much above 10. I think it's extremely difficult to run big research groups, and I've seen junior colleagues burnt many times because they have a big famous boss who's paying no attention to what they're doing. So small research groups which are agile. No departments or divisions. We won't have the 120 divided up into cell biology, immunology, or whatever, because that encourages barons. It encourages barriers who then fight each other from their castles. And what we will have is a bottom-up academic organization of interest groups where you can join 1 interest group, 2 interest groups, or 3 interest groups, and that looks after the academic side, the seminars, the scientific discourse, the retreats. But it is not coupled with budgetary control beyond driving that sort of dialogue. And the objective there is to reduce boundaries and not have barons fighting each other for resource, which I'm afraid is very common in a university setting. So that is something different as well. Finally, resources, whenever possible, will allocate on an institute-wide basis, by which I mean we'll have very good quality technical cores, microscopes, mass spec, all these sorts of things, where researchers have immediate and good access and do not have to wastefully duplicate in each individual laboratory. So that's really important. I've already discussed this a little bit, but let's just run through it again. About 2/3 or a little more than that will be junior appointments, a 6 plus 6 year career structure with a light touch review, direct recruitment of outstanding people, core support to help them, a review at 6 years in case they have burnt, which does happen, so we can deal with it. And then after 12 years, move, not always to a UK institution, but if they do, as I said, we'll support them. We also will have secondments from our 3 universities, particularly young new recruits, so they can get a starting to their research career in a very supportive environment, and then will return back to their department after 5 years. So we never take over their employment. They remain in University College, King's, or Imperial. 1/3 of the PIs are senior, like me. They will be on rolling contracts reviewed every 5 years. And if they fail the research review, they are moved on. And they have a second role, as well as being excellent researchers. They have to have a second role to support their junior colleagues. If they don't want to do that, they leave. Part of their job is to support their junior colleagues. And then finally, we'll have a few strategic appointments with universities in particular areas, particularly in that multidisciplinary level. Postdocs will be a large group within the Institute, and we're going to turn the postdoc position into a career development position. In other words, a 4-year position which not only is doing research for their group leader, but has also got a career development aspect to it as well, rather like a graduate student. Because the postdoc community often are the neglected tribe. People, they're neither students nor independent, and this is to give support to postdocs. I've mentioned already the training and career development program at all levels, and generally we won't allow people to stay on. A clinical postdoc program is also under development, where we give postdoctoral experience to those that are clinically trained. I want to touch on women in science. It's something dear to my heart. My own daughter is a scientist. She's a physicist. She's just had a baby, and I've first-hand experiencing, or rather second-hand, grandfather hand, the issues that are around there. We all know the issue that in biomedicine, 50% of researchers at an early stage are women, and this drops to around 20% at later stages. We will try and help with this by giving greater flexibility, particularly with a couple of initiatives, both indicated here. Crucial, I think, is the ability to allow women during their childbearing time to have a part-time appointment and to be judged on part-time performance. You hear what I say? Often part-time appointments are not judged on part-time performance. But because we are core funded, we're not reliant on external agencies who are invisible to this. Because we are core funded, we can judge performance of somebody who has decided to work half-time and perhaps have a research group of 2 or 3 people, so they remain active for a period of 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and then it's easier for them to return. I think this is critical. It's very practical, but I think it's critical and helps. The second is childcare support. Usually this is a discussion about creche. I have to tell you, a creche is not a practical possibility in central London. Nobody who has no mother or father wants to bring a 6-month-old baby on the underground for 45 minutes to a creche. So we are looking at putting money through a childcare voucher system that will pay a significant part of childcare costs wherever they may be, rather than through an internally creche-funded system. Again, there is no such scheme at the moment in the UK, and I just have to get that through my master's. Well, they may not like it, because although they say they want to do it, actually it will push up their wage bills across the board. So I'm prepared to do it because it puts pressure on them. But they, of course, put pressure on me too, so it'll be an interesting interaction. Permeability, satellites and secondments from our 3 universities. The satellite groups is a new initiative, and it's to how to promote interdisciplinary research in the physical and clinical sciences. In my experience, many people talk about this, and they want to say a physicist to work in biomedicine. The physicists are rather reluctant to leave their tribe. You know, they like to be surrounded by physicists, actually. And recruiting such individuals can be very difficult. I tried that a lot at Rockefeller when I was in New York. And even though we were very strong, it was always difficult. So the way I want to get out of that is through our 3 universities, that we will allow a physics, maths, chemist, computing to set up a small satellite group in the Crick, so maintaining their base in our home department, but having 2 to 3 individuals for a period of time working in the Crick, or we can send people to their department to work on a combined project. So they keep their home base, but whilst they're carrying out these joint projects, then they will have a satellite group. And I've already mentioned secondments for early career researchers for training the universities, and of course we'll have jointly funded graduate students. Let me turn to the lab design. This is a picture, and I'm going to fly you through it in a couple of minutes, okay? So there's be another video in a moment. Hopefully it will work. The lab is designed horizontally rather than vertically, following the notion that that floors get in the way. If you have tall buildings, it may make use of the square meterage, but you simply break up the organization. So 4 lab floors above the ground. The basement has all the most of the support facilities, animal containment imaging facilities. We have space, in fact, for a little more than this, 1,400 researchers. I have to say 1,300 for the health and safety people, but it'll be around 1,400. We have a great lecture theatre, which you see there, that sort of pod thing that looks as if it's landed from outer space. It's big enough for 500 people, and we can split it in 2 for 250 ones. 80,000 square meters, and May the 31st. You see that date, end of this month. This is what it looks like from an aerial photograph. Let me just show. You can see St. Pancras Station. This is the institute. The architect designed it so it would sort of respond to that big engine shed. It's located behind the British Library. The British Library is the building to the right there. So it's sandwiched between great public buildings, St. Pancras Station, the Eurostar Terminal, King's Cross Station, the British Library, and poor domestic housing on the other 2 sides. It's a challenge to get something that would fit in there. And we have a responsibility to assist with that local community. So already I've established a public engagement program with schools. We've already put on enough events before we've opened. I think we've seen now nearly 4,000 pupils from the local area of Camden who have had engagement. 4,000, and that's before we've opened. And so it's a very serious part of what we are doing. So we're well connected. This is what it looks like now. And by the way, King's Cross is a vibrant area being developed. This is what it looked like, not exactly when we started, but this is built. This was a photograph taken about 56, probably 70 years ago. These were the marshalling yards, the railway marshalling yards at St. Pancras Station. It was heavily bombed in the Second World War, and the site was vacant for 50 years. The British Library went on part of it. This was the one big site that was left open in central London. I made a bid to get it. I had to go and see Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and he let us have it for half price. We got it for half price. Then, of course, David Cameron came in and was told he should cancel it, so I had to go and see him then and persuade him it was a good idea. And so it has sometimes been a political struggle. This is the front of the building. This is now real. In front of it, you see a piece of public art. It's a sculpture. I raised some money from the Wellcome Trust for a sculpture. It's called Paradigm. It's a conceptual piece of art by Shawcross. It is a sculpture which is 14 meters high. This is a significant thing, and you get a sense of the size of it. It represents a growing idea from a very small base to a big base, and as in all science, still a bit unstable. Maybe if you put something else on top, it all falls over. You know? That's a bit like science. Okay, now I'm going to hope this will work. This should be a video. So I'm going to fly you through the building. This was an architectural mock-up. Here we start again with the logo, and we are going to run through the building. So the building is in colour, and everything around it is in grey. This is so you know what to concentrate on. And we're flying around Eurostar. We're only 20 metres away from the exit of Eurostar, so we're extremely well connected to Northwest Europe. Paris in 2 hours, Brussels in 2 hours, Paris in 2 hours, 15 minutes. This is Eurostar just here. And now, we're now coming down by that poor housing there on the right into the institute. So it's a large building, as you can see. You get a sense of the size of, yes, good. You get a sense of the size here. It's rather like a chromosome, with a centromere for those who are biologists, okay? And we see 2 arms coming out here, and we're going to fly in and you'll see what it looks like. But you get a sense of the scale. It is actually terrifying, the scale. Absolutely terrifying. So we're coming up. It's called the Francis Crick Institute. I was responsible for the name. It was called something else when we were setting it up. We now come into the public space, which is open to the general public. That's this space here. That's the lecture theatre. And if you look up, you can see how the 4 floors are very open to each other. You wander around, you see everybody else. That's the idea. You're not in the typical academic sort of boxes that you find in most research institutions. This is an exhibition space. We're working with the British Library and the British Museum, where I'm a trustee, in fact, so that we can put on joint exhibitions. This is interaction space on the ground floor, but we have one of these at every floor as you go up, so that you spill out of the labs if you want coffee, if you need to go to the lavatories, if you want to have discussions. This is the administrative structure for the floor system. You'll see it's completely open, more like a sort of hospital or an airport than the usual small offices. And now we're flying to the back of the building, 2 sides over to an atrium, typical labs, but open out onto that atrium, very open, very well soundproofed though, I have to say. And then typical, a write-up area, a lab area that we have here, and you can see how that looks, a shared area in the middle, and then a mirror image, lab area, and so on, going to the outside of the building. Any particular lab will find itself surrounded by 4 or 5 other labs in an open configuration. So it's difficult to hide. It's difficult to hide. In fact, that may be something we want to talk about. Now we're flying back, you get a sense of the scale, and we come out at the back of the building, where we've made a little square for the local inhabitants that is where they will have access, and you can see where we fly back up through that domestic housing, and you'll get a view of what it will look like. So that's the institute. I may try and stop this now. Yes, and that gives you a sense of what it's like. We will open. I get the keys this month, as I said. Being builders being what they are, I suspect it'll be next month, but that's the aim. It's a very complicated building. We have 24,000 sensors in it. So I expect when we get in there, the blinds will go up and down every time a cloud goes across the sun, and usual sort of thing. It's the most complicated building in London, but I'm hoping over the next couple of months we'll get that working, and the whole institute should be fully operational early next year. So that's the Francis Crick Institute.
Thank you very much. And we do have some mics on both sides, so anybody who wants to ask some questions.
Great, I'd like questions. I'm a little deaf, so do speak loudly and slowly. And if I don't answer the question you asked, just ask it again, okay? Hello.
Hi. Wonderful talk and a wonderful institute and concept. I just wondered how the major competitors in the UK view the Crick Institute when I'm thinking about as Oxford and Cambridge that have always had such a high profile in the UK and attracting their students. This is going to sup up most of the students.
Well, of course, they're academics, so the usual jealousy and,
Right.
stabbing in the back goes on, okay? They're frightened a bit, actually, but of course they have no need to be. We're tiny. One clinical department in Oxford is 50% bigger than the Crick. University College, where we have Link, has 900 group leaders. We have 120. We are actually big in the sense that we're under a single roof, big in the sense we have high aspiration, and they worry about that, but it's good for them. It's actually good for them. But in actual fact, of course, we won't suck up all the students. We will have around 250 students. We initiated our program this year. We had 35 slots for students. I mean, Oxford has, I think, 1,000 in it. I mean, it's just a completely different level. But let me say one thing. Those 35 slots, we had 1,350 applicants. 1,350 applicants for those 35 slots. And that's what I mean. With that sort of interest, our quality can be exceptional. And Oxford and Cambridge and others don't feel comfortable with the fact that we are upping the game, but it'll be good for them. They don't say that, of course, but it'll be good for them.
And what is your selection process for who gets in there?
Do you know, it's really difficult. When you have 350 applicants, that's a real problem. So we triage to get it down to about 250. And then I have a committee looking at it, and we invite about 100, 120 for interview. So we interview. And so and that's an interview, by the way, which will not be with the group leader. Initially, it's with a committee. So I had students who were interested in me. They had to get over a group committee first before I could actually look at them. So it's a pretty tough business for all of us, actually. It takes 2 or 3 days. But we get good students, excellent students. Hi.
Thank you very much. A very exciting vision, and congratulations. My question is a very practical one. You're targeting early career investigators. You have a substantial number of postdocs, and you have lots of students. Yet you're cited in one of the most expensive cities in the world. I just wonder what considerations you've given to sort of residences or somehow helping them out.
So thank you for the question, because it allows me to readdress the central London location. So, of course, I had quite a political battle as to why to place it in one of the most expensive cities in the centre. And my argument was really rather straightforward. London is a very attractive place for young people to come and work. Simple as that. We have to attract every year up to 200 younger researchers to keep this thing working, between 1 and 200. They do not want to go to Bedford or Luton or Birmingham or Leeds. If you are in New York wanting to sell an institute, they will come to London, and some will go to Oxford and Cambridge. But you cannot attract to some of these other places. So it's very, very attractive. What that means is that they will put up with the difficulties and expense of living in London. They have small apartments, they have to travel, for the advantages that London can bring. Later in life, that may change, but that is the engine room of our research, that particular age. Now, what can we do to help them? Several things. I mean, one is we have to pay them, I won't say a proper wage, because academics are never paid a proper wage, but we can at least pay them at the top end of what is possible. And if that means having fewer, we will have fewer. So we'll pay them at the top end of what we can do. I tried to get my founders to let me put up housing. They wouldn't fund it. They wouldn't fund it. It's not part of the way that the UK works. I still nag them about it, but I'm going to fail. There's no point. The Wellcome Trust said they would do it, but they wanted a block that would mean rents that were 50% higher than our students and postdocs could afford. It was hopeless. It wasn't helpful. Second thing we can do is provide a very, very good information service for all recruits coming in. This is not expensive, but incredibly important. If you take a big city, if you come from the United States, you will think most cities are dangerous, and you can't live in most places. If you come from Tokyo, you will think the entire city is entirely safe. It's just a cultural difference from where you come from. What we can tell them is what areas of the city are okay to live in, which in the case of London is actually 90% of it. There's very few places that you couldn't recommend. There's some places that look scruffy and down at heel, but they're perfectly safe. And then you can say, how much does it cost if you want to live in Hampstead or Highgate, the sort of top end? How much does it cost to live somewhere else which is cheaper, but you've got, how quick can you travel in? And we'll have all of that ready for people coming, so that helps. The third thing is, of course, the usual way of handing on from student to student. My students and postdocs hand on their apartments, and they work in places where it can operate. So we haven't solved the problem, because I'd have liked to have had more money for it. But remember, we're merging institutes that have worked in London for over 50 years. So they will come and it will work. It's not easy, but the advantages of a central London site are hugely significant. So
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk this morning. But my question is also practical.
Yep.
Here we are in Alberta. Here we are in a oil-poor region, unfortunately. And the question that I have is, how do we convince people, for example, in Ottawa, that we should be investing this huge amount of money in building such an institute for Canadian researchers?
Well, the first thing I will say is, of course, I'm not suggesting that the type of institute that I'm putting up here is the only way to deliver a research agenda. I mean, I am very much in favour of a pluralistic approach. There's different ways of doing it, through the great universities, through smaller institutes, through a bigger institute. It has to be tailored to local circumstances. So I'm not for one moment trying to argue this is the only way to do things. I do think it's somewhat unusual, and there may be things to be learnt from it, but I wouldn't necessarily try and sell this approach, certainly until we've shown it works, but it has to be tailored to local circumstances. But the general point you make is the one as to how do we persuade our political masters of the importance of discovery research for driving the economy, improving the quality of life, improving health, improving protection of the environment. And that ultimately requires a good and healthy relationship between the science community, the public at large, and our policymakers. And it's a responsibility of many in this room, particularly of myself in my role, to drive that public engagement program. In my experience, if you invest time in promoting these arguments, if you talk to the public and our politicians in a reasonable way, rather than lecturing them, which is what academics do all the time, if you interact with them in a way where you treat them with respect, they, on the whole, not always, but on the whole, they will come with you. Now, sometimes, of course, governments can come in place, and maybe Canada suffered this in the recent past, which makes it very difficult. But in my experience in the UK, with with governments of different colours, they have been persuaded of the importance of science to drive the public good. So although I mentioned it, although the civil servants said this is something you can cut when Cameron came in, when I went to see him in Downing Street, he was persuaded, and persuaded in half an hour. And George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has been a huge supporter. In fact, he's come and topped out the building. He can't open it. I'll get the Queen to open it, but there is a huge support for it. So we have to work on that engagement. There is a danger that scientists and academics generally retreat into that ivory tower. They get a sense of entitlement. I'm a great supporter of discovery research and the freedoms, but you have to sell it, and you have to work at selling it. There's no point in assuming you just get it. I sometimes use the term we have to earn our license to operate, constantly earn our license to operate, and that requires work. So I'm optimistic about it, but it does require work.
Thank you very much. What an exciting vision. I had two particular points, but perhaps you've more or less addressed them with what you've just said.
Yep.
One of the things that we hear about a lot now is translational science, and we almost hear less and less and less about the importance of discovery science to the whole process of translation and commercialization and so on down at this end of the spectrum that always seems to go from that way to that way. And so the very fundamental nature of discovery science and how you've built this, I think, is really important, and I'd love to hear more about that. And the second piece that, again, you've just talked about a little bit is the importance of public engagement in the whole process of translation of
So
discovery science.
let's deal with the first part first. The way I described it, I use these words, is that discovery research, where you give freedom to individuals and release the creativity of individuals, is the most effective way to produce new knowledge. The more top-down driven and the more restrictive issues arise. When you are close to application, you have to be top-down driven because it's obvious you have milestones and so on to deliver. But a significant part of the research agenda does not thrive on too much top-down control. And I think one of the mistakes that happens is that society or our political leaders, obviously and rightly concerned about this investment leading to the public good, think that the only way to do that is to drive certain priorities and objectives and drive that right down, not realizing that often that attracts the more mediocre scientists who are just simply following the money. They just don't get it unless it's explained to them. And that goes back to the former question. What you need to do with that is high quality scientific leadership who will drive that scientific leadership, because the politicians won't always argue against the scientific leadership if it is unified, but you have to work on it. So the idea of discovery research that generates knowledge, but then on top of that a mechanism and processes which ensure that discoveries are properly exploited and translated when appropriate, is the way that I'm approaching it. It needs a cultural difference. We don't want the snobbery of the discovery scientists saying, I don't want to think about application and so on, which happens. You have to have a culture which says, this is acceptable, this is good, this is something we should do. That's the first bit. Sounds simple, but I mean, I'm afraid academics can be complete snobs, and some of them are. So it has to be part of what we do. Then you need to have much more creative ways of capturing science, both for clinical translation and commercial translation. What are we doing within the Institute? One is I've appointed as a Chief Operating Officer and Director of Translation the person who used to run the Pfizer research site in Sandwich, which was a research activity of 4,000 people, who ran it for 7 years, huge experience of this whole business, and he is on the management team. He runs that. So we have real practical experience of how to do it on the ground, combined with the pointy-headed people like me. Okay, so that's one thing. The clinical research, because biomedical research, we have no beds, no patients. I've hired Peter Ratcliffe, who was the chair of medicine in Oxford for the last 15 years. He has resigned that position to come and run our clinical research program. Once again, we have in the Biomedical Research Institute pointy-headed PhDs connected to, in fact, one of the best clinical researchers in the UK. He got the Gairdner about 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm just being practical. I've had several questions of practical. I'm getting the best I can in the UK to drive that agenda. Public engagement. We need to earn our license to operate. That means we need to have a strong public engagement program, and it is strong. I already mentioned about school kids. We go from that up to politicians. We have a program whereby everybody can engage. And I, again, am persuading our group leaders that this is something important that has to be done and supported. And if they have somebody in the lab who's good at it, they need to give them time to do it. You know, we will insist upon it. Not, well, they can't go out for a week because they've got to, handle liquid again in Eppendorf tubes, which is what we mostly do, and they need to get on with with their research. We have to say this is important, and if we have somebody who's really good at it, you should nurture them. So it's a culture thing again. We make that acceptable. I've done a lot of it, so I can ensure that we will do that. And because we're in London, because we're a national institute, we have impact direct on government. And we have very strong links at the highest level of government. So that we will do engagement at all levels. We had a Crick open science night in the Science Museum in London, and we had 7,000 people turn up for it. For the 4 hours that we were open, 7,000. I mean, there is an appetite for it which we can deliver, and we have to work on it. Stephanie.
Thanks, Paul. It's all terribly exciting. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you envision the mentorship of the junior group leaders by the more senior scientists. I think we can learn a lot about that here.
Stephanie and myself were colleagues. She was my graduate student quite some years ago in the UK. This junior-senior group leader issue is very important to me and to the Institute, because if we take as one of our primary missions training and nurturing and developing often researchers who are at their most creative time but often green, often don't know what's up, who make many mistakes, and if we can help them through that, then I think we have a formula for real success. Core funding helps, advice helps. Now, not all junior group leaders want advice. You've got to be realistic about this. I mean, they might need it, but you have to be careful with it, because some people don't want people like me staring over their shoulders all the time. Some want more. So you have to tailor it according to the individual. What we will do is we won't have a departments and divisions, but we will have a light level management system to deal with HR issues and employment issues and so on. But then each junior group leader will have one or two assigned advisors from the Institute or from outside, if that's better, to help them through issues that they may want to deal with. We will have a regular yearly meeting, which will be more formal to assess how they're doing, and a formal review at 6 years, but an informal review that will involve external people every 2.5 to 3 years. So quite a lot of reviewing, but reviewing mostly with the intent of helping, advising, and helping them through, with a more formal one at 6 years and, of course, an exit review. So that's sort of more or less in summary. Now, the principle I described there was aimed at group leaders, but the principle is also aimed at the graduate program and the postdoc program and our technician program. We always forget about technical training, or not always, but often, and we are trying to also have the same approach, that we'll train technical staff in, say, mass spec or whatever, and then help place them elsewhere in the country. So the whole thing becomes a training hub. And it'll be buzzy as a consequence, but the whole thing is a training hub. Because otherwise, why have an institute? Universities are pretty good these days, and you need to have something here that allows us to do things in a somewhat different way that universities can then maybe pick up. Thank you.
I was very much interested in the beginning part of your presentation, where you said you brought together 6 different, 3 institutes and 3 universities. Yeah. And we, too, are trying to bring together diverse groups here to form a greater whole. And there are, as you well said, jurisdictional issues, turf wars, jealousies, and so on. You must have some interesting stories to tell about how you brought these diverse groups together. And are there any pearls that you could share with us in doing that?
I'll tell you a funny story, if you promise not to repeat it, about how I got planning permission, but we'll do that at the end. The first thing I have to say is that I had a lot of support from the organizations. I mean, I was pushing at an open door at the leadership level. When it came to the apparatchik level, it was less easy. I mean, that's again not so unusual. At the leadership level, both the Medical Research Council and Cancer Research UK had operational problems. They both had real estate which was old and tired. Mill Hill was outside central London, was designed in the 1930s, put up in 1940. Cancer Research UK had an institute that was built in the 1950s. And these were tired. They need replacing. So, if you like, operational requirements meant they had to look for a solution, and this provided a solution. Of course, I was aware of that, so that I could push at an open door at it. But this allowed their problem to be solved. So MRC and CRUK at the leadership level saw this was something new, saw it solve their problems, so supported it. Their finance offices tried to suck out as much money as they could, And so I had to have tantrums and so on, which I did, and got most of it back, but not quite all of it back. And that sort of worked. The Wellcome Trust then felt, as it always does, that it couldn't sit on the sidelines, but it is a minor player compared to the other two, but felt it wanted to put some money in. The three universities were something different. Initially, University College jumped first and got involved, but then vetoed both any other university from being involved. So for 18 months, I had a constant row. I mean, you're not surprised, are you? No. They vetoed Imperial College and King's College. I wanted all three for good reasons, I have to say. And I must have had 6 meetings with the leadership of University College. And in the end, I said, well, I'll just walk away if you don't do it. So they allowed Imperial and King's to join. Now, as I said, they can gang up against me. So it's sort of quite a reversal. But also, this whole project is of a size and importance for London that it arises local problems like planning permission. So now I'm going to tell you a story about getting planning permission. Because Camden, we're in Camden, wanted to use this space for social housing and for a shopping mall. And when Brown overturned that and gave it to this, they didn't like it. And when we applied for planning permission, it was going southwards. It looked as if it would be rejected at the local level. Now, I don't know if you have in Canada, in planning decisions, what can only be described in England, it's called Section 106, is essentially a bribe to the planning authority. I mean, you don't call it a bribe, of course, but it'll be a sum of money that can be given to... you know what sort of thing I'm talking about? Yes. And the point about the rules in the UK is that money is given to the authority that gives planning permission. If the local authority doesn't approve it, I can appeal to the mayor. If the mayor doesn't approve it, I can appeal to the government. Okay? And if it goes to the government, it's the government that gets its money. With a building of this size, and all costs, it's close to $1 billion Canadian dollars, so this is huge investment, then the amount of money for the local authority would be 30 million Canadian dollars. This is not insignificant for a local authority. But I didn't want the local authority to turn it down, because that would mean we have sour relationships for years. So what I decided to do was to go and see the mayor, one Boris Johnson, who you may read about, and I thought if I can get him to unofficially approve it and then leak it to Camden, they realise they will lose, and they will lose also 30 million Canadian dollars, or 15, 20 million pounds. I went to see Boris, who is a colourful character. I read about him before I got in there, and he was interested in the classics. I took my town planners. He had his town planners. He has an attention span of about 15 seconds. So he was lost interest in the whole thing in about 2 minutes. So I thought, this isn't working either. And then I remembered what I'd read about the classics. And he had on his bookcase a book which was a new translation by Robert Fagles of Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil. And by some fluke, I'd bought it a few weeks before and read a few verses. So in a pause, we stopped talking about the building. I said, had he read this translation? Okay. And he immediately woke up, and he said he hadn't read it yet. Had I read it? And, I'd read a few verses. I could say about 5 sentences about Virgil. I mean, not 6, but certainly 5 sentences. And he got quite excited by it. Then he sort of looked at the town planners and he said, rather than listen to all these, why don't we consult the oracle as to whether you should get planning permission? And he said, what I will do is I will open the Aeneid randomly. You will choose a verse and read it out, and I will interpret it, and based on this, we'll decide whether your building should be built. I know you don't believe it. Every word I'm saying is completely true, okay? So he opens the book. I scan the verses really quickly. I discover a verse which says, the temple of Apollo will be built on firm foundations. I read this out to him. He slams it shut and says, the oracle has spoken. I will approve this building. The town planners, their mouths are all wide open, And we leave. They cannot believe what has happened, okay. Of course, he decided beforehand probably he would do it, but it was a good piece of theatre. So then I got somebody to leak this solution to the Camden local council, so they knew they'd be overturned. I had to go to the public meeting of the zoning, do you call it zoning here? Yes, like in the US. And it was political membership, spoke against it, all voted for it. So we didn't have local opposition. Now they quite like it. We've been very good to the local community in various ways. Whilst it was being built, they turned it into an allotment. We turned it into an allotment. They grew vegetables on it and so on, whilst doing the planning. I told you about the school programs. We now don't have a problem. But if they turned it down, that problem would have persisted. So that was my most colourful one. But actually, there's things like that that occurred throughout this whole process. So you have to be nimble to deal with it. Sorry, that was a long story, but
It was fun. Thank you very much for a tremendous presentation. And I'm particularly intrigued by your recruitment process where you pick the best individual regardless of what they are. It's not, Canadians can relate to that because we follow the hockey draft and you pick the best player usually. For Edmonton, it doesn't work out most of the time, but I'm wondering how you reconcile that strategy, which seems really a particularly innovative one for academia, to the three sort of disciplines that you have, come up with: immunology, cancer, and neuroscience. So, in some ways, you are picking winners. Is that correct?
So several comments. Firstly, if you looked at that, the 7 questions, they covered most of biomedicine. We need a certain focus. Cancer Research UK is putting in £50 million a year. So they do have to have their interests recognised. But of course, much of basic research has some relevance to cancer. So if you are brave enough, you open the doors, and over time you will get across the board. You will get it. You have to hang on. When I was at Rockefeller, I persuaded them of the same strategy, and they didn't understand it, donors and so on. Then they got it, because it happened. It did happen. You got people who'd come in. Now, if you don't get, let's take cancer. If you didn't get any cancer, and we're hiring 8 people a year. We will find people. But if you don't after 2 or 3 years, of course we can have a focused search. It's not completely out of the window, and even there, it's a broad area. It really does work. You just have to you just have to be calm. What will happen is we'll open the search. I'll open it in October, and we won't get certain areas, and people suddenly will panic. And we just have to wait 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It will happen most likely, and if it doesn't, we can correct. So I'm pragmatic about it. I am pragmatic, but I am the best at. I have so often seen directed searches that end up with second class because that's the best they can get at the time they're searching. It happens all the time. And this way, we maximize the chances of getting the highest quality.
So on behalf of the Board of Directors from IHE and from Alberta Innovates, thank you so much for coming to Alberta and spending some time with us. And please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you.
Sir Paul.